For all intents and purposes, the U.S., Ukraine, the world remains on high alert. NATO's Secretary General has said that members of the alliance have not seen any sign of de-escalation from Russia. He even mentioned today that the number of Russian troops around Ukraine is 150,000, which is a higher number than we've heard. Putin began to sound something of a different note. He appeared on television this week, including one appearance at a very large and long table with his foreign minister, who was briefing him on the diplomacy around Ukraine. Putin said that Russia is, quote, ready to continue on the negotiating track, but will keep pushing for a rollback of the NATO presence in Eastern Europe and a guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO.
To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine. World War II was a war of necessity. But if Russia attacks Ukraine, it would be a war of choice or a war without cause or reason. The world will not forget that Russia chose needless death and destruction. Invading Ukraine will prove to be a self-inflicted wound.
You are in Kyiv, I should have said, and you just recently wrote a piece for The New Yorker about how people there are dealing with this constant warning of the imminence of war.
Yeah, I've been here about a week. And when I arrived, I felt like people still weren't quite believing the talk of war, at least not the way it was being discussed in the West. And that was a narrative that had been picked up on by many of my colleagues who had been here much longer before. I think the most important kind of underlying or historical factor we should keep in mind is what war, especially brought and instigated by Russia, means for Ukraine. Nothing new.
The pro-Russian separatist leaders of these breakaway regions of Ukraine, Luhansk and Donetsk, have made a series of announcements. They've ordered the evacuation of civilians to Russia. We saw women and children beginning to be bussed into Russia. This continued to escalate into today as those leaders called for a mobilization of all military-aged men in those regions. So if you're a guy from 18 to, I think, 55, you can't leave because you're being called up to serve in the war. Meanwhile, Russian television is kind of in a frenzy, reporting on ethnic cleansing, genocide against Russian speakers or ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine. But we've seen also some things getting blown up in eastern Ukraine. I'm very pleased to be joined now by Christopher Miller. He is a correspondent for BuzzFeed News covering national security and extremism, and he is currently talking to us from Kharkiv, Ukraine, which is along Ukraine's eastern border.
The last, I would say, handful of days have felt much more intense than the last month. You know, there has been a sort of steady buildup. Just between my first visit in this January and now, there's been a pretty steady increase in the number of attacks, artillery bombardments, the number of casualties on the front line. So we're seeing a pretty significant increase in fighting, which is different than we've seen in the past couple of years. We're not quite at the level of all-out war that we saw in spring, summer of 2014, which was really intense, casualties, deaths in the dozens, if not hundreds, on an almost daily or weekly basis. And hopefully we don't get to that point.
We saw Vladimir Putin really cast the die yesterday. We saw him hold a Russian Security Council meeting with his top advisors, in which they each, looking very threatened and uncomfortable, endorsed the idea of recognizing the so-called People's Republic of Donetsk and People's Republic of Luhansk. Then after that meeting came a very long and very troubling and rambling speech by Vladimir Putin, in which he seemed to question Ukraine's very right to exist. Then on Tuesday, we saw Putin double down on his announcements from Monday as Russian lawmakers gave him permission to use military force outside of Russia to back the separatists and to back the claim of the separatists to the entire Donbas region. Right now, the Russian-backed separatists only control a portion of that area. Russia has now authorized the use of military force to essentially claim the independence of the entire region of Donbas. And I think, based on Putin's rhetoric, there are obviously worries that he's going to go farther than just that. Putin also gave a list of 3 demands that had to be met by Ukraine and the West: international recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, an end to Ukraine's NATO membership bid, and a halt of all weapons shipments to Ukraine. So Putin continuing to set the diplomatic bar far above where he knows the United States or the West is willing to go, and certainly the people of Ukraine have been willing to go. It's been a very dramatic few days. Early Thursday morning, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with Putin calling it a, quote, special military operation intended to, among other things, denazify the Ukrainian government. And so I think from the outset, it seemed quite clear that this was the worst-case scenario of a large-scale invasion and really an effort to decapitate the Ukrainian government and install an alternative Russian-controlled, essentially, government. There have been explosions across Ukraine, including in the capital, Kyiv, which we must remember, and as you'll hear from Tanya, is a city of 2.8 million people. Enormous human suffering already underway, and tragically, the risk of much more. Right now, there's really a battle underway for control of Kyiv, and there have been blasts heard throughout the night, and the U.S. has been warning that Kyiv could potentially be captured by Russian forces in a matter of days. Putin continues to claim that it is fighting Ukrainian, quote, nationalists. He's called on Ukraine's armed forces to surrender. For his part, President Zelensky, of course, has made clear his determination to resist, but he made clear that he's not going anywhere and really leading not just the military operations for Ukraine, but what could become of the Ukrainian resistance. Ukraine has declared martial law. It's also distributed 18,000 assault rifles to citizens in Kyiv to mount a continued armed defense against a Russian invasion. Ukrainian men aged 18 to 60 are barred from leaving the country. They're being called up into that resistance. Ukraine's military has called on residents to resist in other parts of the country too, not just Kyiv, urging people to make Molotov cocktails to take on the occupier. Russia, though, has surrounded Ukraine from three sides. It's firing missiles from the land and the sea. And we've had the initial response from the rest of the world. Putin has warned of grave consequences for anyone considering interfering with Russian plans, making allusion to his nuclear deterrent. NATO has called the invasion a brutal act of war, and President Biden is convening an emergency session of NATO and their discussion of additional deployments to support the Eastern allies within NATO. We are very pleased to be joined by Tanya Kozyreva, who is an investigative journalist based in Kyiv.
I'm in Kiev, and now I'm based in the hotel, which is in the city center. The first siren was at 2 a.m. today. So we went to the bomb shelter, and I think we spent there like the whole day, and we couldn't get a chance to go and report from the streets because like every 2 hours there is a warning to go to the bomb shelter. We went to the grocery shops today. It's literally across the street from our hotel, and there was no food. It's getting worse. It was pretty normal yesterday. You know, we went on the streets, we reported, we went to the train station, we went to the shelters, to the bomb shelters. We speak with the people on the streets. The situation changed completely over the 24 hours. You know, it's like, I mean, it's really bad right now, to be honest, and I have no idea how bad it's gonna be in next 24 hours because of the shellings. Probably the grocery shops is not getting any food, that they're just short for food, and probably because of that also many workers cannot get to their working place.
Basically normal life, people going to work, people having access to things like food. Today is the day that kind of stopped being a possibility.
I think none of my friends are going to the office right now. They're stuck in their home, and like every 2 hours they're going to the bomb shelter. So it's the same situation for everybody. News-wise, it's a lot of news. The other problem is disinformation. You know, so right now there are a lot of facts which are spreaded through the social media. For example, there was a news regarding the President Zelensky and his closest ally left Ukraine already. The president and his closest allies has to make a video next to the presidential administration saying, no, we are still here, we are still in Ukraine. The misinformation is a big problem right now because it's hard to tell what is true and what is false.
What would you say to them, to our governments, to the U.S. government and European governments? What are the people of
the explosion. Sorry, I have to hide in at least in the bathroom where there is no window.
You just tell me when you're okay or if you need to go.
It was one explosion. I don't know if it. So and there is no sound of wording to go to the bomb shelter. Okay, I think I can continue here for a while. Whereas there is no window here, at least. What were you saying? Sorry.
Well, it's a good. What do you want? What would the people of Ukraine want the U.S. and Europe to do that they're not doing? I mean, we saw some sanctions announced. What is your message to the people, to the governments of Europe and the United States, from the perspective of the people of Ukraine?
So, as you can see, the sanctions that was imposed by U.S. government or by the government of UK and any other government, that like those sanctions doesn't work. The sanctions has to be really painful for Russia, you know, for Russia, for President Putin himself and for his closest allies and Russian oligarchs. You know, I'm saying to all my foreign friends or all my friends abroad, instead of showing me the solidarity, please ask your politicians or your leaders of your own country to impose as many sanctions as you can on the President Putin and his closest allies, and just make this war stop, because we are in Ukraine, a very peaceful country. We want peace and we want to live in our own country. We don't want to live under the occupation, or we don't want to be a part of Russia.
This terrifying attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. This was a military assault on a nuclear power plant in a country where the Chernobyl meltdown happened in 1986. Like, you couldn't think of a worse idea. Several Ukrainian soldiers were killed. One of the buildings at the plant caught fire. There was reportedly damage to the, quote, structure of the reactor compartment at one of the reactors. We've been assured that there's no risk or sign of radiation leak so far. I mean, the good news is radiation leaks you can kind of measure in real time, but you never know if there's risk of meltdown. And the nuclear staff are reportedly being forced to work at gunpoint. So, Ben, these guys are clearly trying to control key infrastructure so they can lay siege to the civilian population. And, this facility needs constant power and water that remains cool and under control.
This sense, if the Russian objective appears to be to really terrorize Ukrainians into giving up, essentially, the weaponization of energy infrastructure could only just further ratchet this up too.
We've talked about the challenges the Russian army has had in the north, especially this 40 some odd mile caravan of military vehicles that has been stuck for several days. But the reality is that Russia has made considerable progress taking territory in cities in the south. They captured the city of Kherson, and many fear there will soon be an attack on the port city of Odessa. Our producer Haley talked to a woman named Olena Dunira, a 29-year-old mother of a 3-month-old and a 5-year-old who were born and raised in Odessa. Here's a clip.
I think the waiting is the worst, because it's been for 3 days. We heard of these ships around the city. My feeling is for them to finally take a step forward so we could just deal with this problem. I think people in Odessa are absolutely ready to respond. The military forces and also the volunteers, the preparation they did throughout these last several days are great. I think that Odessa people also feel a little bit maybe guilty because most of the cities in Ukraine under attack, they're suffering at the moment, and in Odessa it is quite safe and quiet. So I think that Odessa people want to join this glorious fighting of Ukrainians and to show the aggressor where he should be. and that he is not welcome here. I have no idea. I have no idea what to do. What to do with two little kids abroad. I know that all people around the world are very kind to Ukrainians now, and they take refugees as close relatives and help wherever it is possible. But still, I can't imagine live abroad. I can't imagine that. It is terrible because my 5-year-old child already knows what is shelter, what is bombing, how tanks work. He also asked me why these bad people try to assault us, and this is a very existential question. Not all the adult ones know the answer to it.
We are very pleased to welcome back to the podcast Ukraine expert and correspondent for BuzzFeed News, Christopher Miller, who is currently reporting from an area around Kyiv. What have you been up to the last 24, 48 hours? What have you seen? What's going on around you?
I mean, a lot has changed since the last time we spoke. It's been a really, really rough week. Not only in Kiev, but around Ukraine. There's been massive bombardments of missiles. There have been airstrikes, indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, and every single day, sometimes multiple times a day, it's the news comes in about another civilian building hit, a school hit, a hospital, an ambulance. It's been really, really tough. Russian forces are really, really bearing down on a lot of Ukraine's strategic locations. Military installations are getting hit really, really hard. And there also is really this, I think, terror campaign that is intensifying. Vladimir Putin has said that he's not attacking civilians, which is a blatant lie. What we've seen in the last week in Kiev and areas around are entire towns, villages on the edge of Kiev that are being fought over, destroyed. More than 1 million people now have left the country, and many more are on their way west and trying to get to the EU to seek safety. And there are even more people who aren't able to leave, who are stuck still living in their basements. It's become a lot harder to just simply survive for millions of Ukrainians. Not only those in Kiev, which really does feel like a city under siege, but across the country.
How are people there who are staying kind of preparing for and thinking about what may be a pretty incredibly difficult period of weeks here under some form of siege or bombardment?
The mood is pretty grim. People are trying to get out. There's been a rush to try to flee by train. The scenes that we saw were just really, really difficult to see. It was a mad scramble for not the last seat, but really like the last square inches on a train to try to get out west. And I think there are still some trains running, and the people who are keeping these trains running are the heroes for doing so under shelling and trying to evacuate a population that's upwards of 3.5 million people. There are definitely a lot of people who see Kiev or the place where they live as their home. They don't want to leave under any circumstances. They also are taking this, they're sort of defiantly deciding to stay, and that's kind of their own personal protest or middle finger to Russia. I would say one of the surreal things is to see, everyone, like mothers, grandmothers, dads, kids, 18, 17-year-old boys, with firearms. Everywhere you go, you see men coming out of a grocery store or a gas station, or just literally anywhere. Walking with a shopping bag down the street, and they're armed, and they're building an arsenal of weapons. They're building Molotov cocktails. by the thousands. And, they've sort of industrialized this manufacturing of homemade and makeshift weapons to a really large extent.
This decision to sanction oil and gas, inevitable, needed.
I think what's happening is the gravity of a major war in Europe is really sunk into the politics and public opinion of democracies. I think the same thing is going to happen in Europe. They don't want to do it. They may hold out for longer, but they're cutting significant checks to Russia. Russia is going to have to be, in a context of sanctions, sustaining a quagmire, right? Paying for its military machine, paying for the supply chains into Ukraine to carry out an occupation. You just can't be subsidizing that. You want to make it impossible for Putin to sustain a multi-year occupation of Ukraine.
There have been 3 rounds of, I think, largely unsuccessful talks between Ukrainian and Russian officials. The Kremlin has demanded that Ukraine amend its constitution, reject claims to enter NATO or the EU, and then recognize Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk as Russian, those eastern areas that they've been occupying. That's not going to happen.
The People's Republics.
Yes, sorry, my bad. Russia has
bullshit.
Yeah, totally. Russia has proposed various ceasefires and the creation of humanitarian corridors. Then they immediately break those commitments. So let's talk about refugees. So the United Nations said that more than 2 million people have fled Ukraine since the Russian invasion on February 24th. We wanted to play you guys 2 clips from Ukrainians describing what the experience is like.
When you walk through the city, you see Ukrainian flags everywhere. You see restaurants advertising that Ukrainians can eat there for free if they want to, or that a percentage of their income revenue is going to go to help refugees or the Ukrainian military. So as a Ukrainian myself, I felt extremely welcomed, and it's truly great to see so many people helping. When I was at the border, I didn't only see people from Poland. I saw people who drove all the way from Italy or all the way from Denmark, who just stood with signs saying that they're ready to pick families, like women and children, up and drive them back to their countries and help them resettle there, right? Because Europe is being so welcoming with the Ukrainian refugees that it's totally doable from a legal standpoint to just move anywhere in Europe. So it's been very eye-opening, and I expected to see an extremely sad situation. I expected to see truly humanitarian catastrophe, which of course in some sense it is, because that's just what's going to happen when over 1 million people flee their homes. But I've talked to a lot of people, and I've heard a lot of side conversations, and people have cried when talking to me about how grateful they are that Poland is being so nice to them and so welcoming.
All over Ukraine, there are evacuation trains from all over Ukraine coming to Lviv, and people on these trains, they're lying on the floors. They're it's a horrible situation, and it's a nightmare, to be honest, to see all those kids and all those women, stuck. I don't even have the words to explain what are the conditions in those evacuation trains, because it's people are desperately trying to get out, and they're packed as it's just horrible. And we saw near the border, we saw this long lines of cars where people also sometimes they are spending there 3 days. And so it's kind of a it's horrible. I don't have any words to describe. I think Lviv is one of the cities that doesn't really see the war. There is no bombshelling, there is no explosions in Lviv, but at the same time, you can see this impact of the war. You can see this human cost of the war.
The good news now is we're seeing a lot of states and people be welcoming to Ukrainians. You do have to wonder how long that goodwill will extend, because it's going to create stress on these neighboring countries as they try to support these huge inflows of people. And we just over time, I think history suggests that countries get less welcoming to refugees over time, and it's something I'm mindful of and worried about. The Russians still appear to be making the most progress in the south and the east of Ukraine. They're pushing up from Crimea. They're trying to encircle and siege cities like Mariupol and cut off the Ukrainian military forces fighting in the east and the Donbass. Russia continues to attack civilian areas. There's reports that about 2,000 cars worth of civilians were able to escape Mariupol, but a similar number are stuck and still waiting. That 40-mile convoy that everyone has been talking about in the north is slowly reorganizing and moving towards encircling Kiev, but the key takeaway seems to be that the Russians are now moving slowly. They're more deliberate, and they're trying to use drones and other means to protect themselves and improve their targeting and force protection, presumably because the Pentagon estimates that they have lost 10% of their forces. There are reports that the head and the number 2 guys at the FSB, which is Russia's foreign intelligence branch, their CIA, have been arrested, presumably for, things going south in the war effort. And 2, Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the leader of Chechnya, who, as I think you mentioned on a previous show, is
super creep,
historical asshole.
Yeah.
He's a huge piece of
World
shit.
historical piece of shit.
Yes. Horrible guy. Who wears $1,500 Prada boots while being with his military. He's reportedly in Ukraine and has personally joined the war effort, according to, because it's 2022, I think, photos on his Instagram. So that's a bad update.
Putin has been in extreme isolation throughout COVID for whatever strange reason, and that he has basically been listening to some really strange ideologues who've been hitting all these notes about like Russian history in the last 1,000 years and the restoration of, Russian authority over Ukraine. And so he's like sidelining hardliners who are not crazy enough, right? Like
he's importing hardliners.
It's not like the FSB people are like a bunch of like moderates, or like, but he's just like, so that's never a good sign, right? That there. And then Kadyrov, I saw the videos he was posting. You can't verify them. He claimed that he was on the outskirts of Kyiv with a bunch of Chechen fighters. I think that the reason that's alarming is a couple of levels, right? The first is, as we talked about, these guys are like usually the most brutal fighters in the kind of proxies of available to Putin. And frankly, if what we're seeing in Ukraine recalls what happened to Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, which is leveled, followed by like mass torture and repression. Like Kadyrov, this is a guy who's tortured people, who's assassinated people, who's been a part of real excesses in terms of human rights violations.
We want to play you a clip from an 18-year-old Ukrainian named Vlad. He's from Zaporizhzhia. He's home with his mom and grandmother while his dad is fighting on the front lines, and he is talking about a friend of his who he just graduated high school with who was killed in the fighting. Here's a clip.
So I studied with him in the Ukrainian Leadership Academy, and why I talk about that is because pictures to see on media is not enough if you don't hear personal stories that can actually connect us with the events that take place here. And just imagine a 19-year-old guy who wanted to build a military career. He was very kind and disciplined, and I imagine that if the war didn't start, he would be probably a military of defense in a few years. And what I want to say is that he didn't have fear to sacrifice himself for our country, and it's someone you could see on the street. It's a standard normal high schooler that graduates from the school and goes to be in a military sphere, and then the war takes place, and he's not scared to defend his country, and then he just suddenly dies, and you can't believe that this happened. You kind of post a story on Instagram with the words of pain, but you can't believe, and you do the fact checking again because you think that someone will text you, oh no, what did you post? He's still alive. And it's just imagine your friends. Just imagine that this happens to your country. And so how can we say that helping Ukraine further, like closing the sky or giving planes, how can it escalate the conflict if it's escalate to the degree that can't be any further top? I mean, Putin is trying to invade NATO countries too. So why do we have to wait until then? Why can't we stop that? So people like your friends, like your colleagues, like people you studied with in high school, like my friends, stop dying.
Pretty devastating reality for, a lot of people in Ukraine right now. Your classmates are going to war and dying. Your father's somewhere fighting. You don't know if he's okay. Your mom, sister are trying to get out. I mean, it's pretty horrific.
Russia
it clearly draws like no distinction between a civilian and military target in a way that even the U.S. military, like in its worst, does not deliberately target civilians, journalists, etc.
Yeah, I mean, you can see videos of tanks just drilling
just
shells
into apartment buildings as a strategy, and again, we saw this in Grozny. Like there's a Russian and Putin based approach that's just like, okay, if you won't surrender to us, we're just going to destroy your cities and to terrorize your populations. And that's what we're watching before our eyes.
I mean, the point you made about how long this could take, the point you made about how the Russians are probably trying to kill journalists and drive them out so that people don't know what's going on is certainly on the mind of Ukrainians.
I'm really worried about, once the next big thing comes, then the flow of attention and the flow of money and the flow of information is going to could crumble. But that's where the real work starts, because we have a lot of ruined cities. We have a lot of dead civilians. We have a lot of stuff that needs to be rebuilt, and that's going to take years.
I know that this is going to go from the front page, disappear from the front pages, because it's going to drag for a long time. Please don't forget about us, and please remember we are fighting for the basic humane values against something that's as close as it can get to pure evil, because they are fighting against the freedom, and it's not some extra word, it's freedom to express yourself, to do the things you want in any way. So it's like oxygen for us people, like Ukrainians or British or French or Americans. So don't forget about this. This is a very important fight, and maybe a historic fight for the whole world.
As the leader of my nation, I'm addressing the President Biden. You are the leader of the nation, of your great nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace.
These Ukrainians, man, they speak Ukrainian, Russian, perfect English.
Yeah.
God knows how many other languages. He also played a gut-wrenching, roughly 2-minute video of sort of what Ukraine was like before and after the invasion that included some really graphic video of wounded and killed civilians. Ben, I think Zelensky has proven to be masterful when it comes to tailoring his message to tug on the heartstrings of the audience. He invoked Churchill during his speech to Britain's House of Commons. He was, directly appealing to Justin Trudeau in his speech up in Canada. It's also clear that he wants to sound grateful to the U.S. for all the support that's come through, while also strongly pressuring the White House to do more.
Zelensky's this populist of kind of idealism and community, and the one common thread in all of his speeches to these democracies is he's hitting our deepest historical chords in every country, right? And he's basically highlighting the gap between who we say we are and what we actually do.
Mm-hmm.
And these people in Ukraine are fighting and dying on the front lines for democracy. And it's kind of stirred something inside of our democracies about this is all supposed to be about something more important than our narrow partisan objectives. So today he addressed the German Bundestag, the German parliament, and he went after them.
Oh, really?
He hit the Holocaust, and the words "never again" need to mean something. And he said, all we heard from you over the years when we were warning you about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, was business, business, business. You care more about business than you care about democracy, basically.
Wow.
Was his message. And you built a wall around us. And he said, tear down this wall. So once again, this guy, every country
there's a Forrest Gump vibe.
He's got a list.
Through.
Yeah. But there's a mentality, too, of this guy ran out of fucks to give a long time ago, and and you would too, obviously, if there were bombs and shells raining down on your city.
President Biden called Putin a pure thug and a murderous dictator Thursday. That tracks. On Wednesday, he called Putin a war criminal, which set off a flurry of nerds correcting him. That determination has to be made by the International Criminal Court or United Nations or blah, blah, blah. Obviously, Putin is a war criminal. His goons are bombing maternity hospitals and a theater with hundreds of civilians inside it that had children written in big text outside of them. The Kremlin whined that Biden's rhetoric was unacceptable and unforgivable. And fuck you.
Yeah, fuck off.
So then Putin gives this belligerent, authoritarian, frightening speech where he says things like, quote, The Russian people will always be able to distinguish true patriots from scum and traitors, and will simply spit them out like an insect in their mouth onto the pavement. Okay. He seemed to call out oligarchs who have voiced concern about the war and called them, quote, national traitors, who, I'm summarizing now, are more concerned about their villas in Miami or the French Riviera, quote, who cannot make do without foie gras, oysters, or gender freedom.
We are very pleased to be joined by Vietor, who's the youngest member of the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's just start with where are you and what's the situation around you right now?
I'm in Kiev. Kiev right now is a city that has cleared out Russian incursions that we had, and battle is happening on the outskirts. Basically, we're planning a trip tomorrow to the outskirts, to one of the embattled cities, which took already too much.
I think we all remember the Maidan and the Revolution of Dignity in 2013, which feels like a very long time ago. But obviously, people like you and Alexandra have lived this last decade from that moment to where we are now.
The reality is it's a free generation. It's a generation that's been born after the Soviet Union, of people like myself who only know independent Ukraine and only imagine independent Ukraine in which they can function, they can dream, they can realize whatever ambitions, goals they have. Ukraine has plenty of problems as a democratic state that is honest with itself. And we, step by step, year by year, reform after reform, have been trying to solve these problems. And the reality is we were going on that path that leads to Western democracy, which shall give all the citizens instruments to battle against whatever ills disturb their circumstance or their ambition. But again, it all changed because of the fact that Russia decided to destroy our statehood and destroy my nation. Mr. Putin doesn't regard our nation as in existence, doesn't regard my state as worth existing. And the point is that our generation is the living proof that he's wrong. And that's why so many of my generation have died in the war that went on since 2014 and will die in this war every single day. And the point is our generation will do everything possible to prove Putin wrong and to show to him that our nation is not just in reality, but so many are willing to stand up for that reality and even die for that reality because they don't want any other reality of any ambitions that he has for my nation.
We checked back in with a woman named Alexandra. She's a 21-year-old Ukrainian activist and law student who we first spoke with a few weeks ago when she was on her way to a youth leadership conference out of the country. Unfortunately, while she was gone, her home in Kharkiv has been bombed and destroyed. So here's Alexandra talking about that.
I don't really feel anything towards it. And I don't know whether it is a good thing or a bad thing, because, like, for example, when the night we did this decision to go away from my hometown and the day we actually did it, I was like, okay, no hometown anymore, no thinking about it, nothing happened. Okay, I am moving forward, like keep moving. Nothing matters as far as me and my family is safe. So yeah, really, I was like, not to say that I was expecting, like, because everyone who is leaving their home, they are like, please let my home survive. It will happen to every home, but not mine. But in reality, it doesn't work like this. So yeah, but I don't know, I just don't feel anything. And I don't know whether it is like a good thing that I just have this superpower of isolating my feelings and being very rational, or is it a bad thing, like I am just keeping it inside and I will have this moment of breakdown where this whole thing breaks out. And yeah, I don't know, but we'll see.
Pretty amazing composure there. But also, a reminder of the cost for individuals, even those who are out of the country and surviving. I mean, I saw the Ukrainian economics minister estimate that this war has already cost them $500 billion. The news over the weekend was truly horrifying. We talked last week about how the Russians were going to pull back the military from Kiev and focus on the east. They did that, and that's allowed the Ukrainian forces to get into these areas. It's allowed journalists to get into the areas that had been occupied and cut off. And what they found was wide-scale evidence of war crimes. In the town of Bucha, hundreds of citizens were executed. They were bound, shot, left in the streets. There were mass graves. There are stories about rape, torture, people on the brink of starvation. Afterwards, after this news came out, President Biden reiterated his belief that Putin has committed war crimes. President Zelensky visited Bucha. You could literally see the pain on his face. He called it genocide. The State Department says they believe what happened in Bucha is not an isolated incident, but a systemic effort. So you have to worry about what else we're going to find in cities that have been occupied. European countries are now talking about banning coal, oil, maybe gas, although the Germans are really dragging their feet on banning oil and gas because they're so reliant on it still. Biden says there's going to be more sanctions, and then he wants to put Putin on trial basically for war crimes. I mean, it's hard not to see these images and just feel fucking bloodlust.
It was some of the most gut-wrenching imagery you'd ever see. And Tommy, what really got me is thinking about what are we going to find in Mariupol? What are we going to find? And this is one suburb of Kyiv, and there's no reason to believe that the Russians aren't doing in other places what they did in Bucha. I think that the word genocide is not one you use lightly because it has a very specific meaning, right? It's not just a war crime or a crime against humanity. But in this case, I think we have to actually start thinking about that word, because when you look at what they're doing in terms of the indiscriminate killing of Ukrainians, the deportations of Ukrainians into Russia, and then like the rhetoric around Ukraine shouldn't exist as a country. And there's some Russian state media that is very chilling to read about essentially needing to eliminate Ukraine. That's genocide. Continuing to send Russia checks every day to buy gas and just feels like morally untenable. And I know how difficult this is for Europe, and it's maybe easier for us to say that from America, where we're not dependent on Russian gas in the same way they are. But I just think that the sanctions have to get to a level where there's not these kind of massive carve-outs for tremendous infusions of revenue into Russia from the sale of oil and gas and coal. Europe has started down this road with coal, which is the easiest thing to do. But I do think that you can't just keep buying gas from someone that's committing genocide in Europe. We're only like a month and a half into this war. Like, it does make you think, where's this going to be in 6 or 8 months? And that's truly scary to think about, above all for Ukrainians. But I mean, it does speak to the potential for this thing to continue to escalate.
I mean, there are new reports almost every day about civilian casualties, about war crimes by Russian forces. There's the occupation of Bucha, the shelling of a railway station full of civilians and kids over the weekend. The mayor of Mariupol says 10,000 civilians have been killed. Chernihiv was under siege for weeks. I know that you personally, your team, you've been visiting some of these places. I mean, what has that experience been like for you, and what have you seen?
I think it's first reaction you get is shock. You see this in movies about the Second World War, when there's like villages completely destroyed, where people are executed, women are raped, children are raped. You hear this and you think, okay, this can't be true. This is so horrific that you think that maybe we're exaggerating. Maybe these reports are not true. And then you go to the site, then you see this, then you see, for example, the town of Borodyanka, 40 kilometers northwest of Kyiv, completely destroyed. All high-rise buildings were bombed with airstrikes. There's under one building, they found, in the first day of rescue operations, they found 26 bodies. In the town of Chernihiv, which we visited, under one building, they found 47 bodies. And that's one building. Yeah. And when you walk those streets, destroyed streets, for example, in Bucha, when you walk the streets, you see people lying. You see people lying there for weeks. Kids, women, lacking body parts, tanks burned, there's buildings destroyed. And when you see this with your own eyes, you feel like something died inside. You think that, well, your life won't be the same. This is something that changes your life.
The next phase of this Russian assault on Ukraine appears to have started Monday. President Zelensky announced via a video address that the bulk of the Russian military is now focused on the Donbas region, which is that easternmost part of Ukraine. The Russian army looks like they have increased shelling of targets in the area, and they're still moving troops and supplies into position for a larger ground invasion. The Pentagon is warning that the Russians may have learned from their initial mistakes in the war. They're not going to get as overextended. They will likely do a better job supplying their troops with logistical and air support. There's a small group of Ukrainian fighters that continue to hold out in Mariupol. Some estimate they're down to about 2,000 troops. They have been under siege for nearly 2 months. They're basically holed up in this massive steel plant complex with underground tunnels and hardened places to hide. It's like the scariest thing I could ever imagine. On Monday, European Union leaders agreed to ban between 2/3 and 90% of Russian oil imports by the end of the year. The range in estimates there kind of depends on who you ask, but it's significant either way. The EU works by consensus and to overcome objections by noted asshole Viktor Orban and his government in Hungary. The leaders had to agree to a Hungarian carve-out where they all will agree to block Russian imports of oil by sea, but allow imports of Russian oil delivered via pipeline. That's a little carve out there. But the EU also agreed in this meeting to provide Ukraine with nearly $10 billion in economic aid. And they also announced additional sanctions, including on Russia's biggest bank. Obviously, implementing this kind of pledge will take some work, but like getting that political agreement done, I mean, imagine 3 months ago that we just saw that happen. I mean, it's pretty monumental.
Yeah, I mean, it's huge in the impact that it could potentially have on Russian revenue and their capacity to sustain what they're doing inside of Ukraine. It's also just like a big potential shift in how Europe is oriented around energy.
Well, before Putin made the reckless and inhumane decision to invade Ukraine, we were already heading toward a colossal food crisis that was likely to outdo the food crisis of 2007, 2008 that we inherited back in the Obama administration. And now what you have is 5 million tons of wheat, corn, sunflower oil stuck in Ukraine because Putin won't allow those stockpiles out. You have Russia, Belarus, two of the largest fertilizer producers in the world, not getting their fertilizer onto the market. In Russia's case, he likes to blame the sanctions, but fertilizer is not sanctioned. It's actually that he created an export ban, and that's Russia's the leading fertilizer producer for the world. So you've seen fertilizer prices go up 2 times before the war in Ukraine, and now they're up roughly 4 times from about a year ago. I mean, think of that. If you're a farmer, that means 1/4 of the fertilizer that you were able to get a year ago, you can get in order to plant and harvest in the way that you had hoped. And so there is a world of pain out there, Ben. And the statistic that I found the most chilling is one that the World Bank put out a week or so ago, which is that for every 1% increase in global food prices, 10 million people fall into extreme poverty.
Are there particular regions that might face a threat of famine or where the reliance on wheat from Ukraine or fertilizer from Belarus and Russia is having a particularly acute impact in terms of putting people's lives in danger?
Well, whenever food prices go up, you always look to the most vulnerable places first. And so just in terms of regional concentration, that takes you immediately to sub-Saharan Africa. And now, both in West and East Africa, you are seeing famine-like conditions looming.
Back in May, I know you went to Ukraine. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you saw? And then it seems clear that Putin's play here is to bomb, eastern Ukraine all day, every day for as long as he possibly can until they relent and basically wait out Western sanctions. What argument do you think you can make to Canadians to keep them committed to the cause in, say, 6 months if gas prices are up, if food prices are up, and this is really hurting them personally?
That's a question that a lot of countries are facing right now in Europe, even in the US. Canada's not facing it. And one of the big reasons is we have the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world. In the early 20th century, a wave of Ukrainian immigrants came and basically settled our prairie provinces. And therefore, there is a deep connection. And Canada, of all the top economies in the world, all the G7, of all the G20, we are the ones there who are most unequivocally in support of Ukraine. And it's a very useful position to have around the table. And everyone knows, whether it's all our allies, they know, Canada is totally pro-Ukraine. And my relationship with Zelensky, who obviously I got to see when I went there just a number of weeks ago, is based on that trust, that he knows there's differences of perspective in some European countries that say, we have to be careful about how the end game plays out. And that's totally legitimate. But the fact that I get to be around that table as well in all those discussions and say yes, but nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. You can't create some sort of deal to end this without bringing Ukraine in as part of it, because they have suffered, they have fought, they are dying for it, and they are angry as hell. But they get to have a say in how this resolves. And all that together, I mean, the one thing that I am incredibly confident about is Russia's not going to be able to outweight the sanctions. We have put in these sanctions internationally, and we are going to hold them for as long as it takes. And it's not just about support for Ukraine. It's about realizing that here is finally a moment where democracies have decided that the line is there. And Russia crossed that line, and we either stand up and fight for democracies and stand for it and push back really hard, even if it's, or especially if it's at cost to ourselves, because we have to be able to follow up on the conviction that we have that democracies matter, that the rules-based order matters, that the UN Charter matters. And that's where collectively we know, as hard as it is, we need to stay absolutely steadfast on sanctions, and they will stay in place for years if necessary. Before the war, before Russia's invasion, if you had talked to citizens of Kharkiv or Mariupol, they would have said, we feel as much Russian as we do Ukrainian, because it's much more Russian speaking. Now, even those most pro-Russian in the past are like, oh my God, we are such proud Ukrainians, even though I can't speak Ukrainian, but I am a proud Ukrainian. It is totally backfired in terms of that. So no matter how he reduces it to rubble, which he's in the process of doing right now, which he needs to be held accountable at the International Criminal Court and everything when this is all said and done, he will never be able to win over Ukraine the way I think his first thought was. And at the same time, the fact that one of his justifications was, oh no, there's too much NATO on our borders, we need to push back. The fact that he has so failed abjectly because Finland and Sweden are now joining NATO really shows just how much he totally miscalculated, misunderstood both the strength of Ukrainians, but also the strength and ability and resolve of democracies to stand up for themselves. So when I was in Ukraine a few weeks ago, I saw people who were exhausted, who were, tired and worried about all of their family members who are on the front, their brothers, their husbands, their family that are, fighting and dying, but grimly resolved to see this through, because the nightmare scenario for them is there is some sort of peace agreement now, and then 3 years from now, Russia decides to finish the job that it wasn't able to finish then, and the world will be distracted with something else.
Or you're living in the next version of Bucha under Russian command. So some key updates. In recent weeks, Russia has taken full control of the Luhansk province in eastern Ukraine, and they're escalating airstrikes on the Donetsk province. Over the weekend, the Russians leveled a 5-story residential building that killed dozens of civilians in Donetsk, so the war crimes continue. There is some anecdotal evidence suggesting that the new long-range U.S. missile systems are getting used effectively by the Ukrainian military to hit targets like Russian ammo depots. There's rumblings that this might be the beginning of a bigger Ukrainian counteroffensive in southern Ukraine, but none of those systems is going to be, a quick fix. It's going to be a long war of attrition.
Ukrainian special forces were somehow able to attack a Russian airbase deep inside Russian-occupied Crimea. That Ukrainian officials said destroyed 9 Russian military planes, which is the worst loss for the Russian military since the war started, and just a huge psychological blow to Russians who thought they were safe in Crimea. But shortly before he came in, there was another mysterious explosion at a Russian arms depot deep in Crimea. So clearly they have some partisans deep inside the peninsula who are helping them out. Here's where this gets complicated, Ben. In a speech talking about these incidents, President Zelensky said that Ukraine will continue fighting to liberate Crimea, which Russia invaded in 2014, basically saying the war's not over until Crimea is liberated. That is a big additional step.
Yeah.
That would take a lot. It's an expansion of the war.
It's kind of signaling, because this seems like it's too far to be artillery, even the artillery we've given them. If they have special forces or partisans who are making Russian stuff blow up in Crimea, it's kind of a message of what would happen anywhere that Russia occupies territory. You know, Russia may be gaining some incremental territory in the east, but they're sending a message like, you're not safe in Crimea. You're not ever going to be safe in Luhansk or Donetsk in the east either. You're not winning territory. You're winning, territory that is going to open up insurgency and death and destruction of your military. That's the message I think.
Yeah, and they're making them defend it, I think, which takes away resources from other places. It has been a pretty extraordinary couple of days for the Ukrainian military, who say they have recaptured 3,500 square miles of territory and liberated 150,000 Ukrainian citizens from Russian control. That's in September. Here's the backstory. So there's been all this talk for weeks about a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russian forces in southern Ukraine near the town of Kherson. They had another plan, which was to simultaneously launch another counteroffensive several hundred miles northeast of Kherson in Kharkiv. What appears to have happened here is the Russians heard about this southern counteroffensive. They redeployed forces from the north to the south in preparation to defend Kherson and left thinly manned lines in the north and inexperienced fighters who just got routed, absolutely routed. In fact, Ukrainian forces were pushing so quickly into Russian territory that many Russian units retreated. They abandoned tons of weapon systems. I saw a video of Russian troops literally jumping out of a moving tank. Did you see this?
Yeah. And there are dudes like stealing cars and bicycles, anything they could get.
It does seem like there was some savvy deception by the Ukrainians. Like they emphasized this offensive in the south, and then they also went into the north. But it's notable that Russian intelligence didn't pick up on any of it.
I was thinking, Tommy, we a few weeks ago had an episode about who's winning the war, And at that point, it was essentially kind of a stalemate. You could make an argument for Ukraine having denied Putin his core objectives, but then you could make an argument that Russia had this strategy in place that we've talked about a lot, which is you kind of swallow up inch by inch more territory to consolidate eastern and southern Ukraine. And then you just squeeze the hell out of the Europeans and try to fracture them by putting them through a nightmarish winter. And this offensive really flips that strategy inside out. Instead of it being a war of attrition that's working for Putin, suddenly it looks like a war of attrition that is going against Putin, which both bolsters Ukrainian morale and also may incentivize the West to provide more weapons and to weather a rough winter because this is working. So it doesn't end the war, but it definitely tips the momentum in the direction of the Ukrainians.
Holding this territory will almost certainly be harder than taking it in this sort of swift offensive. But it's also notable that the Ukrainians cut off a bunch of logistics hubs, and that'll make it harder for Russia to resupply their guys. And it took the Russians months and months and months to win the area around Kharkiv in the first place. So this was like hard fought territory that they just gave up in like a day or two. So we talked last week about the Russian partial mobilization, which I think in the US we'd call a draft. It is starting to look a lot less partial than initial reports seem to suggest. The Russian military there's lots of videos of this, going into poorer ethnic regions of Russia. They're trying to round up as many young men with military experience as possible, maybe give them a couple weeks of like refresher training, and then just throw them at the front lines to prevent further territorial losses. That said, there are lots of reports that Russian men are fleeing the country. They're getting on any available flights. They're driving over the remaining border crossings into countries like Georgia. And, we've seen videos of protests and people fighting with these military recruiters, talking back, which is very dangerous in Russia. It sounds like white-collar workers and then politically connected people seem to be getting exempted from the draft. I guess the US and Russia are more alike than we thought. Very worrisome to imagine Putin putting another 300,000 troops into this fight. But, you can also see in sort of the week or so this has been going on, why he tried to resist this move for as long as possible, given the response. I mean, it's pretty, there's an outcry.
When you have like a rotten, corrupt system, it's going to show when you try to do big things like this. And what it's shown thus far, as you said, is like this really gross targeting of ethnic minority populations in Dagestan or in the far east of Russia, where actually in some of these smaller rural communities, taking all the military age men could actually endanger the lives of everybody who's there, because these are, subsistence farming communities. And the risk for Putin, kind of political instability and sporadic violence and even periodic kind of loss of control over a community here or there in Russia.
So the Ukrainian military is making rapid progress in their effort to push Russians out of eastern Ukraine, the Russian military. We talked a few weeks ago about the shocking breakthroughs that happened in northeastern Ukraine. Now the Ukrainians are making major advances in southern Ukraine, despite the fact that those were the positions that have been reinforced by the Russian military. Ukrainian military analysts say they've been targeting the Russian supply lines in southeastern Ukraine and are close to cutting off about 25,000 Russian soldiers and forcing them to either retreat or get encircled. So that sounds very bad.
For the Russians.
Very good for the Russians.
Yeah.
This is all happening as Putin is claiming to annex territory that is being recaptured as he speaks by Ukrainian forces. And the reality of the war is really breaking through within Russia. Putin admitted mistakes were made during his mobilization effort, their draft effort. He said that men who were wrongly drafted will get sent home. That came after, I think, something like 17 attacks on military recruitment centers and government buildings were reported since the mobilization. He's firing generals left and right. What do you make of Putin giving these increasingly inflammatory speeches? It was this big propaganda event in Red Square, while seemingly allowing, or maybe just not being able to prevent, this open criticism of how badly things are going.
Ukraine doesn't need to literally conquer every inch of territory that Russia has. What they can basically do is strategically encircle the remaining Russian forces and then just pulverize them.
Take rail hubs and stuff.
And just cut them off from each other, and then use the U.S. Provided artillery and their own higher morale to just eviscerate the Russian forces. Putin clearly realized a few weeks ago after the northern offensive that this isn't going well. And he's basically been on an offensive to try to reverse as best he can the momentum. So the mobilization and throwing new bodies at this, the annexation to try to create facts on the ground, de facto Russian control politically of this territory, this PR offensive, this kind of stupid event he did in front of the Kremlin. It's really notable that since Putin has launched, kind of his counteroffensive, it's like a house of cards coming down in Ukraine.
It seems like it's unraveling.
They can't stop the bleeding.
The increasing desperation for Putin is increasing chatter about whether or not Russia might use a nuclear weapon. I've seen people say well, maybe now there's a 10% chance of it happening, which
is wildly
way
high.
too high.
Yeah. To take it seriously, this has never happened in the nuclear age. He's introducing nuclear weapons as a part of his strategy for this war. Whether he uses them or not, it's already part of the strategy because he wants it in the heads of the Ukrainians. He wants it in the heads of NATO. And that's dangerous because, obviously, if he uses them, he's breaking a taboo. But the world has spent a lot of decades trying to create a norm against threatening the use of nuclear weapons and against nuclear weapons kind of being kind of a part of warfare, right? And so you look at other hotspots around the world, India, Pakistan, North Korea, potentially Iran. You just don't want to be in a new world where suddenly the use of smaller nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons is somehow a part of the playbook.
No. Putin continues to strike these civilian targets with missiles and these Iranian-made kamikaze drones. He's killing civilians left and right. And then President Zelensky said that in the past week or so, Russia has destroyed 30% of the country's power stations and other civilian energy infrastructure. So there's just blackouts across the country. And it's obviously incredibly worrisome for Ukraine right as they're going into the winter. On the Russian side of the border, Meduza News, great Russian news outlet, reported that 90,000 Russian troops are either dead, disabled, or have gone AWOL, just a staggering casualty number. Putin's trying to fill that gap, as we've talked about with his draft. He's throwing these new recruits to the front lines with little or no training. On Friday, he said 16,000 new recruits are already in the fighting. I guess the draft is ended, or there's reports that it might have ended on Monday, at least in Moscow, but we'll see. A top UN official said Russia is using rape as a deliberate strategy and tool of war. I saw that Zelensky said after these recent bombings on all the energy infrastructure, Zelensky said, quote, "There is no space left for negotiation with Putin's regime." I both get where he's coming from, but also find quotes like that incredibly unnerving because
there is no off-ramp seemingly anywhere.
Probably the thing that I'm most concerned about is that lines of communication between the White House and the Kremlin are probably as weak as they have been in a very long time. We're now dealing with a type of Russian regime that is actually even more centralized, even more isolated and closed off. I think Putin has consolidated decision-making to a degree that we haven't seen.
The Russians continue to target civilian infrastructure, like we've talked about with these missile strikes, to the point where the mayor of Kiev is warning that residents might need to survive the winter without electricity, water, or heat. So that's how dire things are getting in the biggest city, in the capital city. Western countries, the US, Germany, for example, are sending more and more advanced missile defense systems to try to prevent that shelling from happening, but obviously you can't undo the damage. And then the flip side is Russia is reportedly buying even more advanced ballistic missiles from Iran, or at least preparing to. So things are continuing to escalate. Last week, the Russians officially retreated from the city of Kherson in southeast Ukraine. Russian troops were pinned down on the western side of the Dnipro River, and they were at risk of getting fully cut off from their own supply lines and just killed or captured. So they moved east back further away from Ukraine. Since then, there have been some really dramatic scenes of Ukrainian troops rolling into Kherson, liberating the city. Some of them literally found their own relatives and were able to liberate them. Very, very emotional stuff. Unfortunately, those scenes and stories have also been juxtaposed with deep reporting about what life was like under Russian occupation, which was just horrific.
Situation is very terrible. No gas, gas we had. Electricity, no. Power, no. Connection. This is very important for people. People are lost. We don't know that.
No internet connection.
No internet connection, right. No water. But it's okay. We can wait. We were terrified by Russian army. We were terrified by soldiers that can come any moment in our house, in our home, just open the door like they're living here and steal, kidnap, torture.
We feel free. We are not slaves. We are Ukrainians. We are proud of it.
You can tell these people have just been living in hell since, late February of last year. President Zelensky visited Kherson, and then today he addressed the G20 conference in Bali. He actually referred to it as the G19 to give the finger to Putin. But then as that meeting was happening, the Russians fired an estimated 100 missiles at targets all across Ukraine, including Kiev. Zelensky said once again Russia is targeting their energy infrastructure, basically trying to freeze the country out before winter. So there are reports that at least one Russian missile flew across the border into Poland and exploded, and 2 people were killed about 15 miles from the Ukrainian border. It's not clear if that strike was on purpose, by accident, whether the missile was knocked off course by a Ukrainian missile defense system, what it might have been. Either way, this is the kind of nightmare scenario that people have been worried about, where a NATO member gets hit, the alliance could get pulled into the war.
These different pieces connect, right? Because what Kherson does is it begins to eat away at the only thing that Russia's really gained in this war territorially, which is the connection between Crimea up to eastern Ukraine. And once you start to eat away at that and take back in Kherson, the only major regional capital that Russia had conquered, you start to put at risk Russia's capacity to hold that territory. And so it's a major strategic victory for Ukraine. In response, what does Russia do? They do this kind of indiscriminate pulverizing of infrastructure to make civilians in Ukraine pay the price. The risks of escalation go up as Russia gets kind of weaker and less capable of, confronting Ukraine on the traditional battlefield. Ironically, as Ukraine gets more successful, the risks of escalation might actually go up because Russia's responding in ways that are different than just, an artillery battle in eastern Ukraine.
The U.S. now believes that 100,000 Russian troops are dead or wounded because of the war, just a staggering toll. Look, obviously, I think that the Ukrainian side is the good guys here, to make it simple, and the Russian government is the aggressor and the bad guy. But we cannot lose our humanity and think of 100,000 Russian casualties as anything less than a tragedy for those people, their families, that society. It's like Vladimir Putin made this horrific choice and he is, throwing his own troops and people into the meat grinder, and the Ukrainians are suffering probably just as large a casualty count. And it's just, it's just appalling. Putin continues to just decimate Ukraine's domestic energy infrastructure. The AP ran a report about surgeons having to operate on patients with only headlamps for light, just like awful, harrowing stuff. Western countries are struggling to find or even produce, in some cases, enough ammunition to keep the Ukrainian military supplied. NATO has pledged to fill the gap. They've pledged to fix the Ukrainian power grid, but obviously that is going to take some time. Outside of Ukraine, you got governments in Moldova and across Europe concerned about how to keep people alive this winter. I saw Ben The Economy looked at the impact of energy prices across Europe, and they found that in a normal winter, a 10% rise in real energy prices is associated with a 0.6% increase in deaths. So this year's energy crunch could cause over 100,000 extra deaths of elderly people across Europe. So 100,000 deaths because of this war outside of the fighting.
When people hear Putin threatening the use of nuclear weapons, what scenarios should they be worried about?
First off, it's a pretty scary time. We've got to take Putin's threats seriously. Obviously, I can't get in his head and determine, what exactly he might do. But, certainly there are a range of things that he could do. He could, as you say, launch some kind of smaller yield nuclear weapon, which a lot of people refer to as tactical, but it's important to remember that tactical nuclear weapons don't always mean small yield. They can be the size of a Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb. He could also use it against civilian infrastructure facilities inside Ukraine, as we've seen him do with conventional weapons. He could also do some kind of demonstration effect, potentially over the Black Sea somewhere where no one's necessarily hurt, but it sends a signal that he's willing to use them. One thing is pretty clear is that any use by Putin of a nuclear weapon would be pretty devastating. You'd have impacts on human beings, you'd potentially have people killed, you'd have longer term health issues, environmental damage, and he would have broken a taboo against nuclear use that's held for over 75 years. In effect, Putin, just by threatening to use nuclear weapons, has kind of made use of them in a way, right?
Yeah.
So just threatening has really enabled him to invade a sovereign country, which has resulted in atrocious war crimes. We've now got a humanitarian crisis and even impacts on the global economy. So we're in a position now where nuclear weapons have not been used, but they're kind of in the background supporting and perpetuating a whole lot of things that we care deeply about.
Russia, their strategy is now just hammering Ukraine's energy grid, and doing so as it's about to get very cold. There is no international plan, seemingly, Ben, for a way to fix the energy grid in the near future. And there was another huge missile barrage today, Monday. And now we're at the point where Russia is just saying in press statements like, yeah, we're targeting Ukrainian power plants. They're not even trying to hide it. Now, Ukraine launched a pretty bold response to these attacks. They fired missiles at two Russian military bases that were hundreds of miles over the Russian border. The Russians said it was a drone attack. One of these bases is where Russian long-range bombers are stationed. So that was pretty interesting. These cross-border strikes by Ukraine and hitting targets into Russia has been a Biden administration red line for a while now. The fear is that it might lead Putin to escalate things in some way. But I'm just wondering, at some point, if you're Zelensky and these missile barrages are raining down on Kiev and other cities day after day after day, hitting civilian infrastructure from planes that are often deep in Russian airspace when they're actually firing the missiles, how do you tell Ukraine not to retaliate or to try to take out those targets? I'm not sure that you can.
The use of drones is interesting because this war, as it goes on, we see drones becoming more important with the Iranian-made drones being these kind of kamikaze things launched at Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Now you have Ukraine using drones to strike hundreds of miles into Russia. And you're right, the targets seem to be air bases with the logic that this is where Russia's mounting these attacks from, so why should these not be targets? Again, with time, the risks of escalation or the risks that Ukraine might be doing some things that makes the Biden administration uncomfortable, but Ukraine feels like they have to do it. I think that could continue to be part of the landscape here that we're dealing with. And this winter is a kind of volatile time, right? Because Ukraine can't like launch another offensive to try to recapture territory. So we're going to be in this space of like immense humanitarian hardship in Ukraine and these kind of tit for tat escalations. It's just, man, the longer this war goes on, like obviously above all, the most concerning thing is the suffering of the Ukrainians, but it's also going to be a time that, you know, something could escalate.
Last week, President Biden said he'd be willing to talk with Putin if Putin was, quote, looking for a way to end the war. Putin's spokesman suggested they were open to negotiations, but the starting point has to be the U.S. recognizing annexed territory as Russian. So not a serious proposal from the Russian side if you're Ukrainian. To that end, Ben, I saw today that Putin drove some sort of vehicle, a car, a truck or something, across the now repaired bridge from Russia to Crimea. I'm sure that Putin had like every Russian missile defense system available deployed to protect him for his little drive. But the fact that he'd get that close to the front line, I do think shows how important these annexed territories are to him and his whole persona and narrative about the war. So I worry that red line is pretty firmly held. I don't know.
Ukraine's position is Russia has to vacate all territory, including Crimea. Russia's position is all of their annexations have to go through, which, by the way, includes areas of Ukraine that they've lost in subsequent fighting. And the U.S. position is we support the Ukrainian position, but we're willing to talk. And so there's just not really a window. It's very important, as we've talked about, to keep diplomatic lines open. But right now, nothing about the status quo of the war suggests that there's some middle ground here that could even be found even if you wanted that, right? And so there's going to have to almost certainly be more chapters of fighting before like the balance tips for one of the parties to actually make talks potentially lead to something. Sometimes in wars, like you can have talks about just kind of alleviating immediate humanitarian suffering. Mm-hmm. But in this war, the Russians don't seem to care about that at all.
Humanitarian suffering is very much part of the plan for Vladimir Putin and the Russian side.
The war in Ukraine, on the other hand, he kind of gave a gloomy summary. This is going to be a long-term thing, like no end in sight, essentially was the line from Putin. This takes place amidst an incoming Republican House majority that has vowed to conduct more vigorous oversight of Ukraine spending, has said there's no blank check, in Kevin McCarthy's words, for Ukraine.
It's also true that public support has decreased by a lot, actually, for continuing to provide support to Ukraine. And the Biden administration is still going to want to do it. I mean, the president will still want to do it. And if the U.S. doesn't do it, it's going to be hard to keep Europeans and others doing it. So hence a challenge. But Kevin McCarthy and like the crazy wing of his party, one of the hills they have decided they want to die on is assistance to Ukraine, right? Yeah. And you already saw this play out a little bit in the fall where Kevin McCarthy kind of said, we're not going to do any more of that, or whatever his quote was. And Mike McCall said, yes, we are, right? And so that is setting up to be a conflict. But the oversight is what I think the Biden administration, people sitting there in the White House, and my old job, your old job, are thinking about, right? Yeah. Not just on Ukraine, but on Afghanistan, on a range of issues that were hugely difficult, complex foreign policy issues that the Biden White House had to deal with. And the Republicans are going to look for places to kind of poke at them.
There are legitimate policy questions, right?
Yes.
So the on Ukraine, sending some more people actually, I think, is an appropriate way of saying we do want to make sure that if we're providing tens of billions of dollars in weapons, that we have better oversight into where those are going. And there's an accounting mechanism, and there's proposals in Congress for, some kind of inspector general review. Like that all seems appropriate to me.
Totally.
The nonsense is Marjorie Taylor Greene standing up in front of an audience saying, like, not one more dime for Ukraine. We use the money for Ukraine to build a wall,
Yeah, which is crazy. And the Marjorie Taylor Greene wing that is going to suggest that giving money to Ukraine, continuing to help Ukraine fight against Russia is a waste. That's going to be a louder and louder voice, right, in the Republican Party. And they're now, even if it's a tiny majority, it is a tiny majority, that's going to be something the Biden administration is obviously going to have to deal with.